Well, welcome everyone to CG seminar stroke webinar number 326. It's lovely to see everyone coming in. We've had tremendous registrations numbers for our seminar series on the rethinking the role of the humanities and the arts. And today we have one of the conveners of the series, James Robson, to present to us on resilience, flexibility and normativity, rethinking the role of the humanities in the economy. But before we move to bring James in, let me take you through the webinar protocols. Now, remember that the webinar is recorded and it appears on YouTube, usually within a day or so, and you'll be able to access the proceedings of today on an ongoing basis through the YouTube channel, and which you can reach through our website. Now, during the webinar, we advise you to keep your microphone off, and you don't need to have your camera on either. But of course, when we start the Q&A session and we're bringing people in to the conversation, it's a good idea at that point to turn on your camera, and it's certainly a very good idea to turn on your microphone if you're about to speak. You'll note that there's a speaker view command in the top right-hand corner. We recommend you use that command because it enables you to see who's talking at any given time during the webinar. Now, the procedure for entering the Q&A is as follows. I mean, normally our speaker will go for about half of the webinar, and then the second half will be spent in discussion, questions for the speaker, and even statements by those who are coming in to the webinar. So if you want to ask a question or make your own statement, please indicate what you're going to say in the chat. Use the chat. That's how I, as chair of the webinar, can identify you and bring you into the conversation. Normally, I'll send people a warning, a private message in the chat that I'm going to bring you in, invite you in. When you're invited in, most important, as I said before, to turn on your microphone, turn on your camera, and then when you start speaking, tell us who you are and where you're from. And I should add that my name is Simon Marginson, and I'm the director of the Centre for Global Higher Education, which is why I'm chairing today's webinar. Well, it's a great pleasure to bring my colleague, valued colleague, James Robson in. And James is a joint organizer of this webinar series with Kaho Mok from Hong Kong, and he's co-director of Oxford University's Centre for Skills, Knowledge and Organisational Performance, SCOPE, which relates to, I suppose, what you call the non-university part of tertiary education, but he's also a significant player in both the organisation of our teaching in higher education at Oxford and in the Centre for Global Higher Education, where he's a project member and on the Research Management Committee. And many good things I could tell you about James. We're about to introduce him to the next batch of students for this year, and I've seen his bio, and amongst other things, has a history as a music producer. You may want to ask him about that during the chat, but probably he will say plenty of interesting things about the humanities and the economy, and that's what we'll be talking about today. James, the screen is now yours.
Thanks, Simon. Let me just share my presentation.
Yes, we can see that, James.
See that? Excellent. Yeah. Well, I'll try not to talk too much about music production or indeed woodwork, which I think is also on my my bio. But what I want to do today is talk about the debate around justifications for the arts and humanities in higher education. And it seems to me that the debate around humanities and the arts in crisis has rumbled on for many years, many decades, without really any meaningful resolution. I'm not trying to achieve resolution today, but I think the argument is that we need new ways of framing the argument and thinking about the argument. And so I want to make a tentative approach to doing that. Now, very briefly, so you have a sense of where we're going with the argument, I'll just give a broad overview of what I'm hoping to say today. So the point is that the arts and humanities, as we all know, face fairly extensive criticism, particularly in policy contexts where the focus is overtly and increasingly on the economic purposes of higher education. Now, the ways in which people advocate for arts and humanities degrees, I think, often fail to really connect with the criticism that are leveled at them, because they either sidestep the economic issue or they engage at the level of orthodox economics. I don't think that quite succeeds in really bridging the gap between advocacy and criticism. And so my argument is that there needs to be a fundamental shift in the discourse and mode of justifying the arts and humanities in HE. And this involves reframing how we think about the economic purposes of HE by problematizing orthodox assumptions, particularly around the nature and purpose of work and the role that humanities and arts graduates can, and in normative terms, should play in the economy. And my argument is that the concept of narrative and narrative skills are particularly useful in shifting this debate and in providing a way, a new language into reframing the discourse that positions arts and humanities graduates in more normative roles within the economy as agents of economic change. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to hop around a variety of different bodies of literature. I want to cut across various economic texts, orthodox economics, more heterodox economics, but I also want to talk about the political economy of work, the sociology of work, some philosophy as well. And so across all of this, I think there's room for some quite radical logical acrobatics, and I apologize for those. This is a tentative argument, as I said at the beginning, and in a sense it's emerging, and so I hope that we can use this space as a way of refining it, as a way of challenging it, as a way of tearing it apart. So hopefully you'll do all of that in the question and answer session. Now, if we start in the kind of the core of the argument here, the point is that the arts and humanities are positioned as being in crisis fairly regularly. And this is particularly rooted in a set of criticisms that the purposes of higher education are economic. So a set of policy discourses that emphasize the economic value and purpose of higher education. I think we can think about these in two terms. At the individual level, that higher education should be to deliver high salary returns to individual graduates, and in public terms, that the purpose of HE should be to meet employers' skills demands, thereby increasing productivity and driving economic growth. Now, the reality is that at an aggregate level, data shows that financial returns on arts and humanities degrees do tend to be low. Now, we're all aware of this. We're all aware of many more economically oriented publications and analyses that highlight certain degrees do much better than other degrees, particularly when you take salary data 6 to 18 months after graduation. Now, particular degrees, and I think the arts suffer, especially here, do not do well compared to STEM subjects, more vocational subjects like medicine, dentistry. And so from a policy perspective, there is a serious issue with specific degrees that do not provide graduates with the returns that they might expect when compared to peers. And that's particularly problematic when there's growing amounts of unpaid student loan debt. Now, at the macro or public level, there's also the argument that the skills linked with arts and humanities degrees are not always particularly well aligned to specific needs within the labour market. So they don't target shortages or gaps, which are often framed in terms of technical and specific skills needs. And so, as I've highlighted, what we see in policy discourse, but also public discourse, is increasing criticism, pressure on the arts and humanities, and over regulation, which put at the forefront economic outcomes, salary outcomes, labour market outcomes as a core means of regulating degrees and assigning value to degrees. And unfortunately, I think even in the UK, we're seeing just last year the closure of particular degree courses that failed to meet the specific regulatory needs linked with this understanding of the economic purposes of higher education. And this pressure can only be accentuated by broader economic pressures linked with COVID and wider changes in the labour market. Now, the way in which justifications around the value of arts and humanities are made in response to these growing criticisms and regulatory pressures, I think, take four main forms. The first, focusing on the intrinsic value of arts and humanities. Second, individual economic value. Third, public economic value. And fourth, broader public goods. Now, I'll just very briefly rehearse some of these justifications, although I'm sure most people here will be fairly well familiar with them. But the first, the idea of intrinsic value of arts and humanities degrees is often rooted in Newman's idea of the university, which emphasizes the intrinsic value of knowledge and education for its own sake. And as Helen Small argues in her book around on the value of the humanities, the distinctive disciplinary characteristics and distinctive understandings of what constitute knowledge within the arts and humanities are intrinsically valuable. And so that is enough justification for the existence and indeed the flourishing of the arts and humanities within higher education spaces and higher education curricula. Now, more recently, authors like Paul Ashwin have, although not specifically writing about the arts and humanities, have emphasized the need to shift the discourse from economic purposes onto the educational purposes, which he sees as inducting students into subject-specific bodies of knowledge, as a way, I think, of emphasizing the intrinsic value of education for individuals and society and the intrinsic importance of knowledge. Similarly, Simon, at a recent event, I think made an important point about the intrinsic value of the humanities by saying within an increasingly marketized space, the simple fact that students want to study the arts and humanities is in itself a justification enough. There is intrinsic value in the students agentically demanding to study these subjects. And I think these arguments around intrinsic value are important, they are valuable arguments, but inevitably they resonate most with people who are in the arts and humanities. They sidestep the economic critique by just simply avoiding it and saying that there is intrinsic value. But there are other ways that people do engage with the economic critique. And I think these take, as I highlighted, different forms. The first form is an emphasis on the private and individualized economic value of arts and humanities degree. And the key argument made here in these forms of justification is that the current instruments that are used to capture labour market outcomes fail to really engage with career complexities. And by only recording salary outcomes at 6 months or 18 months, as tends to be the case, doesn't really do justice to the longer term earning potential of arts and humanities graduates as they navigate the labour market in a much more complex, nuanced, and fundamentally different way to their STEM or vocationally oriented peers who will maybe go straight into a reasonably high-paying job. So the argument is, of course, that over the lifetime of an individual, an arts and humanities degree does, in fact, give appropriate financial returns to graduates. Similarly, linked with this argument is the idea that actually the skills that are produced by arts and humanities degrees or are linked with arts and humanities degrees are fundamentally valued within the labour market. And this is the whole argument around transferable skills that I think a lot of the advocacy work focuses on. And this, of course, is borne out by a lot of research, some of which I've done myself, looking at labour market outcomes for graduates 10 years out, humanities graduates 10 years out from their degrees. But similarly, the British Academy has funded a lot of this work and has emphasised that arts and humanities graduates work in a huge variety of sectors, deploying a wide range of skills with their degrees and actually highly valued and well compensated within the labour market. Now, the key issue with some of this research is that it doesn't necessarily engage with debates around credentialism, around what universities these students perhaps went to, or the importance of existing networks of privilege and advantage that people who enter reasonably well paid careers eventually are able to wield. And so, you know, again, it doesn't quite engage fully with the economic criticisms that the arts and humanities are facing. Now, the other, I think, important economic justification relates to the broader public value of the arts and humanities. The first part of the argument is that actually, as I've highlighted, humanities skills, arts and humanities skills are very much needed within the labour market. It's just that they're lost in, I don't know, a sort of poor skills modelling and moral panic-driven discourse that emphasises the need for, you know, lots of technologically driven skills or technical skills linked with fundamental radical changes in the labour market. But actually, if you drill down deeper by interviewing employers and really modelling their skills needs, it's clear that transferable skills will remain very, very vital in the labour market, and these skills are associated with arts and humanities graduates. The other part of the broader public economic justification for these subjects is the important and, in fact, massive economic contribution that arts and humanities graduates make through the creative industries. Now, a recent-ish AHRC report highlighted just exactly how much value is added to the economy through the creative industries. It's the largest sector in the UK, at least, and has a really significant part of, it is a really significant part of the economy, understandably. And the argument is, of course, that arts and humanities graduates make up a significant, although not the only, part of the workforce of that sector. And so different analyses have really emphasized the major economic activities linked with arts and humanities, you know, film, TV, theatre, books, games, production, journalism, etc., 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 to really emphasize the economic impact that arts and humanities have within economies. But of course, some of these arguments slip into general advocacy for arts and humanities activities rather than arts and humanities in higher education, largely because it's very difficult to link a lot of that economic activity specifically with university-based arts and humanities degrees or activity or research. The final piece of advocacy, or the strand of advocacy arguments, is that the arts and humanities provide analytical lenses for understanding the grand challenges in society. So things like providing critical analytical lenses, critical tools for engaging with issues like ethics in AI, history in relation to geopolitics. And by providing graduates with those sorts of analytical skills, those knowledge-based frameworks, the societal debate around these challenges is enriched and much more nuanced. Similarly, the arguments are made that the arts and humanities, through these kinds of critical lenses, act as a critical friend to society, and graduates are able to engage and look at different social issues. I think probably the most important argument is that the arts and humanities, through universities, but more broadly, are fundamentally enriching to society. You know, where would we be without art, without music, without film, etc., etc., etc. And you need a healthy university sector to actually enable the cultural aspects of society to flourish. Similarly, arguments relate to diversity, preparing rounded citizens, etc., etc., etc. But again, these arguments, I think, slip into general advocacy and don't always hit home in relation to arts and humanities in higher education. The reality is, I think, that there's truth in both the criticisms and in the justifications for the arts and humanities. But I think the criticisms, the economic criticisms, the advocacy and the justifications take place independently of each other. There's no joining of these arguments. There's no real meaningful dialogue. And so the attempt to either sidestep the economic arguments or work within economic orthodoxy around skills and growth just doesn't actually connect. And so debates, as I've highlighted, simply rumble on. And clearly, I think what is needed is a fundamental shift, as I highlighted in the beginning, to bring actual meaningful dialogue between critics of the arts and humanities and those advocating for them. I think this requires acknowledging multiplicity of perspectives, but importantly, I think it involves acknowledging the central importance of the relationship between HE and the economy. I don't think it's appropriate to sidestep, even though I think arguments for the intrinsic value of the arts and humanities are well made. I think there needs to be engagement with the economic discourse, because that is where students are coming from. That's where policymakers are coming from. There is a relationship between education and work. There is a relationship between education and economic growth or economic activity. And so that does need to be discussed. But I think we need to problematize what are often reductive and orthodox economic discourses around this by providing a more nuanced account of the economic purposes of higher education. So if we just revisit how we might understand or the economic purposes of higher education, the orthodox articulation of the economic purposes of higher education. And here I'm not talking about the broad purpose of higher education. I'm trying to talk specifically about the economic aspect. I'm not doing down the educational purposes. I just want to focus in on the economic purpose, because I think that's where the heart of the debate around the arts and humanities resides. And so the orthodox approach, I think, would view economic purpose in terms of private and public goods. Privately, the purpose is to provide a positional labour market advantage to graduates, which is reflected in salary returns. The public purpose is to meet employer skills demands, enhance productivity, and drive economic growth. And these ideas are broadly rooted in human capital theory and more generally neoclassical economic assumptions around growth and the labour market. But I think these are problematic, and embedded in them are some key assumptions which are very rarely discussed or articulated. And these relate to the purpose of work and the importance of economic growth. And so that is where I want to focus now and really problematize these assumptions. So I think that embedded within policy discussion around the purpose of higher education and in the debates around the arts and humanities is an assumption that work is understood in instrumentalist terms as the key means by which individuals gain money to live. So the purpose of work is only to earn a living. This is rooted in a whole range of different economic ways of thinking, different economic approaches. And we can go back to classical economics to see just where some of these ideas come from. So in classical economics, work is conceptualized as disutility, something that people do for extrinsic reasons only, and would avoid it if they could. And this is, of course, rooted in Adam Smith's foundational document, The Wealth of Nations, which argues that humanity, although he was specifically critical of the poor, but he did generalize it to humanity, is prone to idleness. It is the interest of every man to live as much at his ease as he can. For Smith, work was toil and trouble, and workers would only engage in it rather than act on natural urges of indolence if they were appropriately compensated through wages. So within the classical economic worldview, only the allure of income motivates humans to work. And so without this, no work would really ever be done. As times changed and perhaps the horrors of the Industrial Revolution were slightly abated, neoclassical economics shifted the concept of paying cost to opportunity cost. And actually the concept of opportunity cost was fundamental to really all economic conceptualizations of labour market and human capital theory, and is a really profound idea. But this shift meant that the idea of work still seen in terms of an instrumentalist idea, but work was seen as being resisted by humans, not because it causes pain, but rather it denies the pleasure of leisure. So people will only give up their leisure hours if appropriately compensated with wages. Now, I mentioned that the current conceptualizations of work are rooted in human capital theory, which, as I'm sure everyone knows, came out of the post-war Chicago School of Economics. And this adopted a neoclassical worldview of work fairly overtly, but also emphasized the idea of consumption as a key motivation for humans, where labor supply was viewed merely in terms of rational choice, with individuals balancing their time between work and leisure. And so the idea is that humans want to maximize utility, profit, leisure, and consumption. And so work enabled leisure and consumption. So if we unpack these assumptions, we could see that I think HE policy frames work in teleological and instrumental terms. The purpose of work is related to salary, and that's why we have these emphases on financial returns, on salary, on graduate outcomes. And importantly, I think, within this worldview, humans are viewed purely as rational seekers of profit, leisure, and consumption. This is the neoliberal homo economicus of Hayek, Friedman, and of course, Gary Becker, the founding father of human capital theory. But this is also the human that authors like Paul Collier have highlighted as a psychopath. This is the psychopathic economic human with no real engagement with community, with reflexivity, with society. And I think given the formative nature of education, it seems bizarre to have such a reductive view of work embedded in the economic purposes of higher education, given the implications that it has for our understanding of what it means to be human, of humanity. Now, there are alternative perspectives, and I think it's clear there are alternative perspectives. We're all aware of them. Marx is a very useful starting point, who argued that work has meaning and importance in its own right. It's the means by which humans express creativity and develop purpose in life. So for Marx, work can be fulfilling, it can have intrinsic value, and I think for Marx, should be an end in its own right. The problem for Marx was that work under capitalism was alienated labor, and that alienation was rooted in power imbalances at the heart of the employer-employee relationship. But Veblen also, I think, took these ideas, which challenged the classical, particularly for him, understanding of humanity and what it means to work, and argued that work can be and should be the pursuit of something useful. Work should be utility, and he referred to this as an instinct of workmanship, and that actually we as humans strive towards purposeful workmanship. Similarly, Hannah Arendt problematized the idea of work and the idea of orthodox economics by developing the ancient Greek distinction between work and life, and differentiated the concepts of labor and work as a useful way of problematizing this, arguing that labor is the necessary work to live, so growing food, preparing food, looking after children, etc. Whereas work sets humans apart from other creatures. It's the act of creating something outside ourselves. And we as humans should and do aspire to work, to be engaged in creative, purposeful activity. And that sits at the heart of thriving and flourishing. And this is a more normative approach to work. Now, moving forward, a number of different sorts of approaches, I think, problematize the orthodox or economic orthodox ideas of work. I think Weber and the neo-institutionalists provide a useful analysis. Weber's work on the Protestant ethic highlighted that work can be rooted in something bigger than money, bigger than financial returns. For him, it was God, it was religion. But the analysis that he provided illustrated the capitalist iron cage that has and is preventing individuals from engaging in such creative and purposeful pursuits. Now, Weber doesn't leave much room for agency and for changing and for shifting from that iron cage, for casting aside the iron cage, although I think more neo-institutionalists do, and they provide room for more agentic and purposeful work. And I think we're seeing those sorts of arguments at the moment in debates within the political economy and sociology of work, as well as more broadly in business studies and industrial relations. For example, Skidelsky and Craig have really emphasized the importance of returning to ideas of meaning and purpose in work and creating good conditions for people to flourish. Similarly, Pink has argued for the fact that humans yearn to do work in the service of something larger than oneself. for more than just a paycheck. And Graeber, in his, I think, really powerful work analyzing bullshit jobs, really emphasizes the damage that purposeless and pointless work can do to human flourishing and the basic human need to do something useful, and the importance of decoupling salary value from human value when talking about work. Now, I think all of these things, it's a sort of slightly haphazard way of problematizing orthodox economic assumptions about what work is. But I think the point is that traditional economics, human capital theory, and HE policy hold that humans are motivated by the pursuit of happiness and utility, but more nuanced views emphasize that humanity is motivated by the pleasure that one derives from fulfilling from a meaningful and fulfilling existence, and the contribution one makes to larger, bigger endeavors, so purpose. So most people's sense of identity, dignity, and self-worth are linked with work. And we as humans are motivated by a desire to engage in worthwhile, purposeful, meaningful activities. We yearn for meaning and purpose in work. And so the argument I want to make here is that rather than fixating on graduate premia, financial returns, and even student employability, HE should focus on empowering students to engage in meaningful, purposeful work when they graduate. So in normative terms, this understanding of work and what it means to be human should be embedded in the individual economic purposes of higher education. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to race through these next few slides. And before I get on to why I think this is important for the arts and humanities, I'm just going to very briefly problematize the second embedded assumption about growth. So, as I highlighted, I think there's the second public economic purpose of higher education is to meet labour market demands, improve productivity, and drive growth. And this is such an unquestioned assumption. It's taken for granted in so many contexts that the emphasis on growing the GDP, which involves, under current conditions, doubling it every year, is taken for granted. And Hickel describes this growthism as the most hegemonic ideologies in modern history. It's rooted in a form of muscular capitalism, which is overtly arranged around increasing levels of industrial production and, of course, consumption. And this is really the embodiment of the neoliberal school of Chicago with Hayek and Friedman, summarized in the Friedman Doctrine, which really emphasizes that all economic activity, in terms of business, in terms of anything really, should be about making money. For business, that's for shareholders. And this is the Friedman Doctrine that emphasizes the importance of money and growth as the fundamental purpose of economic activity. But this is being problematized increasingly by modern economists, scholars, environmental activists, with Mayer, for example, arguing that few social science theories, he's talking about the Friedman Doctrine here, are both so significant and misconceived as to threaten our very existence. But that is precisely what the Friedman Doctrine is doing in the 21st century. It's the idea that actually growth, economic growth within the current climate constraints is fundamentally destroying the planet. And now there are lots of debates around green growth, around decoupling oil from economic growth, about degrowth, anti-growth. But I think here the real question is, why should modern higher education position its public economic value in terms of such a fundamentally damaging understanding of the economy? And of course, the answer is it shouldn't, it mustn't. There are other ways of thinking about this. And Jackson talks about the idea of prosperity. trying to move away from limited reductive ideas around GDP and growth, and argues that prosperity goes beyond material pleasures, beyond material concerns, and emphasizes quality of life, health, happiness of individuals, wider society, and is rooted in relationships and community. So it can include societal wealth and perhaps some idea of growth, but should also include broader economic issues related to social, environmental, well-being, and community values. And I would like to call this a purposeful economy. So I think we should be striving for purposeful work at an individual level and for a purposeful economy at a public or common level. And this should involve shared prosperity, flourishing, purposeful work, of course, community and stakeholder-oriented activities, and it should be green. It should take into account the limitations of our environment. And so rather than fixate on growth, I would argue that higher education should be, the economic purpose of higher education should be to enhance prosperity and develop purposeful economies. This, of course, requires an element of economic change. So just to recap, the argument thus far is that the economic purposes of higher education, as framed currently, have done damage to the arts and humanities. I think they're fundamentally wrong, and we can reposition them and reframe them in terms of empowering students to engage in purposeful work and meaningful work, and to drive the development of purposeful economies and shared prosperity. Now, I think the arts and humanities do very well within these reframed, rearticulated economic purposes. And this is where I think some logical acrobatics are required. And this is where the final section is less thought out. But my argument is narrative is key. And here I want to talk about what I mean by narrative. And I think narrative is something that makes us human. I would argue that narrative is the basic strategy that humans use for coming to terms with time, process, change. They're the ways in which people construct themselves. They make sense of life. They make sense of uncertainty, of flux around them. They're the stories that people tell to form different kinds of understandings of the world, the future, even the economy, even underpinning business activity, as I've argued in another paper. But there are, I think, 4 key different kinds of narratives. There are narratives of belonging and obligation, where people make sense of their communities and find ways of belonging to communities through the development of shared norms and common knowledge. There are narratives of understanding and navigation, where people make sense of the direction of travel, of sharing a worldview. There are narratives which relate to causality. So narrative provides stories that link actions to outcomes, and so provide logical mechanisms for understanding how actions can become purposive. And there's a normative dimension. Narratives provide a vision for the future, and through understanding causality, enable people as agents to make changes to make things happen. So in combination, I think these different types of narrative provide a form of belief system that can fundamentally change behavior in a way that turns anarchy to community, that transforms our lives from nasty, brutish, and short into flourishing. So very briefly, I think the arts and humanities are fundamentally linked with narrative. It's at the heart of what arts and humanities subjects do. And in 2 distinct studies, I highlighted this and argued that actually arts and humanities graduates bring a certain distinctive set of skills, which I've referred to as the narrative skills framework. This relates to narrative communication, persuasion and mastery of language, story crafting, empathy and perspective taking, critical analysis, creativity, imagination and multiplicity, and the ability to work across different modes of communication. I won't go into this in too much depth at this stage, but I think it's important to emphasize that this should be understood holistically and rooted in humanistic knowledge and values. But very briefly, I think this argument is, the argument that I want to make is that these skills are critical for the reformed economic purposes of higher education. And we can see this in terms of the way in which narrative skills help individuals self-form. So we can equate different kinds of narrative skills to sort of reflexive voice that Margaret Archer argues for in terms of agentic, and in fact, Simon Marginson has argued for in terms of agentic self-formation. And so I would say the stories we tell about ourselves to ourselves are part of the process of making ourselves. And those with narrative skills are better positioned to self-make. And this is critical for developing career narratives and a narrative around people's graduates' individual employability and where they want to be in their careers. And this is part of pushing people towards or enabling people to engage in more purposeful work. The second point of the argument is that narrative skills, I think, are both desired by a range of employers for their flexibility, while also providing individuals with the tools to navigate uncertainty by crafting different future options for themselves. And this is really important in a radically changing labour market that we're seeing at the moment in relation to technological development and the need for net zero. And finally, the point I want to make is that narrative skills enable people to craft different futures, to see different futures, to look at the causal relationship between actions and ideal or idealized futures. And that's part of a process of economic change. And so the argument that I would like to make is that narrative skills, which are linked with arts and humanities degrees, are critical to the public economic purpose of higher education in its reformed nature, as part of driving economic change to more purposeful economies. So to summarize, I think the arts and humanities can be a normative mechanism for driving social and economic change through humanistic knowledge, values, and narrative skills rooted in individual agency. And so just very briefly to conclude, I think we really must talk about economic purposes of higher education, but the current framing of these inevitably positions arts and humanities in a vulnerable place. It's reductive and is paints a very damaging view of humanity. So if we reframe those purposes in relation to purposeful work and purposeful the development of a purposeful economy, I think the role that the arts and humanities has to play is really profound, and using narrative and narrative skills, although I've rushed over that, is a potential way for articulating that role within the economy. So apologies for going on. I'll stop there, Simon.
Yeah, thanks, James. I mean, I think the argument is so important that it's almost worth a webinar just around this argument about narrative skills alone, because that is an original and important contribution, I think, to the discussion. But your critique of and explanation of the economics and of policy in this area, of the evolution of economic ideas about work, was really, really valuable too. And, you know, what's really striking about this series is that we're beginning, I think, to say some new things. And it's very good to see so many people here. 105 people, I think we peaked at during James's presentation. And we had 102 yesterday for Tuesday for Cajo Mock. I mean, I think we might be able to get Netflix interested in the box set for this series. It's clearly reaching a lot of people. James, couple of comments and I'll bring some people in. My comments, I'll go back to the earlier discussion about measures, and we're all very conscious in the UK of how we're being crucified by these comparative measures of salary returns to disciplines and to institutions. Obvious problems with that. The attribution of economic returns to the university or the course rather than the social background or the social networks, as well as which are clearly important factors in determining what happens to people in the economy. The idea that, I mean, if you're going to be bringing almost half of your population through tertiary courses, that the idea that they're all going to be high income earning graduates is ridiculous. The structure of the labour market and the professions and earnings doesn't allow for half of the population to earn at stellar salary levels. It's all unrealistic in a sense. But what's always troubled me about the comparative aspect between the disciplines is that, I mean, early salary returns don't give us a clear picture of what happens to anyone doing non-professional programs. The nature of their qualifications are that they're going to be going to many different sectors. And in the case of humanities and arts graduates, and also some basic science graduates, many go on to do a second qualification, which will be more vocational or more professional. And the effects of their first degree aren't necessarily captured in their final contribution to the economy in a clear-cut way. And of course, when people are going on to a second qualification, they're taken out of the comparison of early returns on salaries anyway. So early returns on salaries work quite well in some nested professional occupations where the pathways are clear-cut and people go into their career soon after they leave university and then stay there. But they don't work very well for a lot of other disciplines. So what can we do about that? And if you briefly answer that one, I'll then bring in some other Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a challenging question, isn't it? I think, yeah, probably the argument that I'd like to make is that the reason that we're measuring salary returns and holding those returns with such value is rooted in those sort of orthodox economic assumptions. So my solution is I guess, the same one, that we need to problematize those and reduce the value that we place on those immediate salary return measures. I do think that the arts and humanities, the point you make about people retraining or doing additional study once they have worked out what it is that they want to do is really important. And so a lot of the time, salary returns, particularly measured early on, are really just a measurement of how many people know what they want to do at what time. A lot of the time, I think people, spend several years working out what they want to do for their degrees, and that might be linked with purposeful work. But I think we need to be really cautious of early measures, and one way of doing that might be to just problematize the assumptions that underpin them.
Yes, thanks, James. And now we've got 10 people lined up, and we've got nominally 7 minutes, probably about 10. To deal with them. So what I'm going to do is bring people in batches, ask you to keep your questions brief, and I'll bring in 3 people at a time, and we'll try and get through at least 2 groups if we can. It'll be hard. So first we'll bring in Jan MacArthur, Eliza Brewis, and Aki Yanazawa. James, hold your answers until you've heard all 3, and the first one will be Jan.
Thanks so much, James. I think what you've done is a brilliant, from a critical theory perspective, highlighting all these distortions hidden in plain sight. So I won't go into them, but I think at the base of this is the narrow definition of the economic realm that we have allowed to dominate. And it is ahistorical and it's asocial. And I was interested, I saw Kaho's question about policymakers. And of course, that's the right question to ask. But the problem is, it then helps we continue conceptualizing the economic through the lens of the powerful and the wealthy. How do we engage with people like the powerful and the wealthy in a way that emphasizes is that the economic is not about them.
Oh, Simon, I
Simon,
think
we
you're on
cannot hear
mute.
you. Please unmute yourself.
You're on mute, Simon.
Thanks very much. I do apologise for that. Eliza has got two questions in the chat, Eliza Brewis, and I'm not sure which one she wants me to read out. What I think I'll read out is her second question. I've researched other country contexts without a strong liberal political and economic tradition, Indonesia, Finland, and there's a strong societal acknowledgement and appreciation for the arts and humanities. In these cases, Indigenous philosophies and state-society relations are one thing enabling the positive narrative of arts and humanities. Where might we find this narrative in the English or UK context? I think there is a positive narrative actually in the tradition, but it'd be interesting to see what you make of that, James. And the third question is from Aki Yanazawa. Aki, can you come in now, please?
Thank you very much, Simon and George. This is a very, very interesting and productive discussion. So my question is quite simple that you mentioned about the technology advancement in the last point, but could you elaborate more on how you view the impact of the digitalization and evolution of artificial intelligence on the value and the justification of the arts and the humanities? That's it. Thank you.
James.
Yeah, thanks all. Maybe I'll go in reverse order. So the issue of AI, I think, is really important. I think it's not just AI, it's sort of automation, technological change, and I think this is fundamentally linked with issues around climate change as well, with technology increasingly positioned as key to shifting the nature of work and achieving net zero. I think that all too often discourses around the changing nature of work reside in technical skills. But actually, if you drill down and talk to employers, engage with them, what's often required are skills that enable people to navigate the labour market in resilient, flexible ways. I think that's probably exactly what narrative skills, what I call narrative skills, enable people to do. But yeah, people might refer to those as transferable skills as well. But those sorts of skills that are linked with the arts and humanities, I think, inevitably are critical for the changing nature of work. The issue of Indigenous philosophies, I think, is a really interesting one. And yeah, I'm not sure I've got a very, I definitely haven't got an answer for that. I've maybe got some musings. But I think this is exactly probably a practical level of how you find purpose and meaning through degrees. And it's often rooting degree programs in local societies, local areas, and that has real social value. So I think that's a kind of really important practical point to make. Jan, your point about the dominance of the economic realm and the relationship with people in privilege and power is, I think, really, really important. Now, I think the problem isn't necessarily the dominance of the economic dimension in policy discourse. The problem is a reduced conceptualization of the economic dimension. You see, I think the economic dimension in some areas is really rich and useful, and political economic understandings of society are really important at problematizing relations of power. And so I don't necessarily have a problem with dominance of economics. I have a problem with reductive economics. And so by problematizing economics and bringing in different dimensions around this is, I think, the way forward. Now, personally, in part of the research that I've done over the summer, I've ended up reading Smith's Wealth of Nations and have come to the view that it's fundamentally misunderstood in that people don't also read a theory of moral sentiments alongside it, which is the profound point I think that he makes, that we're not homo economici, we're actually social beings, we're social creatures. Humans are social, and our relationships and our economic relationships are about obligation and society and community.
Thanks, James. That was terrific. Now let's quickly bring in our last three questions, and we'll see if we can get through them. First in that batch of three is Nietzsche and Tim Sina, who's had two interesting comments in the chat. Nietzsche, can you come in, please?
Hello, everyone. I don't know what you expect from me. I am a man of nothing. I have not such a deep idea, but what I bring is a practice, deep-rooted practice I was trying to express when I talk about Buddhism, Hinduism, where I come from. And listening to this very idea of economic and its relationship to arts and humanity education, this is not something we have in our culture. This is, sorry to say, this is purely Western idea. There is nothing like economics and nothing like, salaried value in education, which you do not find in Sanskrit education. I think you all, have heard about and know better than me, maybe. We do not have, I come from that background, and that is why I wanted to raise this point. But, I think it looks like, to me, that small marginal societies, our social arrangements, cultural practices, historical systems, all these do not figure out today in a globalized world. We talk only big, right? Big ideas, big country. We talk about Meghan, Harry, Modi. We talk about Putin. We talk about our big leaders, and then we already form an image of this, what we call truth. And small places like Nepal or Buddha, all this is gone. People don't want to listen to their advice anymore. So we are thrown into this, what I think Martin Heidegger had said, I think, this kind of spiritual emptiness. We do not want to be, we bring a humility. We don't want to be small. We want to be big, big, big. So this is how I understand this relationship between education and economic. And I think what I tried to do in my PhD was this one, and it had a price for me to pay. And today I'm not working as an academic, but I do participate in dialogue like this, and I want to learn more and to share. But thank you, Marginson, for allowing me to share. And I'm so, I feel happy that at least you have my name in your mind.
Thanks, Nietzsche. We'll have to move on quickly, though. Unfortunately.
Where I come from and what I'm doing, I cannot take more time. I have a lot of things to say, but I will not do this time.
I have to move on to the other questions quickly, Nietzsche, because we should really be closing now. Diana, Laurelard, and then I'll take David Mills.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James, for a very interesting talk there. And I do agree that the economic outcomes of work for arts and humanities is very important. And it's important also to focus on meaning and purpose. But there's no ethical content to that particularly. And it would apply equally to CEOs of capitalism who've increased their salaries by 40% this year, I just noticed today. Whereas humanities graduates are capable of valuing the social and cultural impact of their work. So I want to know what you think would define what's distinctive about the value of humanities graduates.
I suspect you're going to hear an answer about narratives, Diana. David,
yeah, but I've got to reply to that. So
yeah, David is going to talk about. David will talk about narratives as well, I think.
Okay, so James, brilliant. The question, I guess, for me is, the liberal arts is about a whole range of skills. We're not talking about the arts and humanities, we're talking about interdisciplinary skills, we're talking about American undergraduates doing composition in their first year. So there's a way in which the arts and humanities are providing narrative skills for everyone. And actually, we all want all our graduates to have narrative skills. So this isn't just about arts and humanities graduates, it's about all graduates. Isn't that a stronger case to make?
Okay, James, you've got the last word, I think.
Yeah, I think that point, David, is absolutely right. I completely agree with you. For those of you who've read my my paper on storycraft, the key point here is that the arts and humanities do not have sole ownership of narrative. I think that's clear, right? But arguably, the way in which text is analysed and produced, the way in which ideas are played with and thrown around, gives them perhaps an advantage in relation to the formation of those skills, particularly rooted in kind of narrative bodies of knowledge. So the kind of knowledge that arts and humanities graduates, I think, form themselves in is more narrativized than other forms of knowledge. But of course, other disciplines do contain narrative. They do relate to narrative. And so I think that the point is that it's not necessarily distinctive or unique to the arts and humanities degrees, but narrative is perhaps more closely aligned to the values and knowledge related to those disciplines. I think I better move on to Diana's point, which is similar, I think. And I guess when you ask what's distinctive here about the arts and humanities, you do want to say there's maybe something in relation to ethical content and moral values. And I think maybe I definitely skimmed over too much of the arguments around narrative at the end. I would make the point that what can be distinctive about the arts and humanities isn't just skills, it's not narrative skills, it's skills and values rooted in humanistic knowledge. And so I think you're absolutely right. I'm in complete agreement with you that the moral dimension is fundamentally important. And that is part of the distinctive offering of arts and humanities subjects, and it can be manifested and enacted through narrative skills and I suppose embodied in future narratives that graduates make about themselves and society and the economy. I think that probably relates as well to Nietzsche's point about societies and higher education contexts which aren't necessarily driven fundamentally by economic discourses, but by either religious or more culturally oriented approaches and values. And it gets back to Elise's point about the importance of Indigenous knowledge here and the connection between local narratives, local values, local knowledge that is, I think, really profound in including in this argument.
Well, sincere thanks, James. I think that was one of the best webinars we've ever had, and really important, and content and original, and thinking that we'll all benefit from in the months to come as we dip back into your presentation on YouTube and perhaps in the podcast version, which we'll also have out soon. Very good to see everyone at the second of our Arts and Humanities webinars, and we do have a third one coming up next Tuesday, in which Kaho Mok will chair, and Simon Shunman Ho, who's the president of Hung Seng University in Hong Kong, will speak. So really looking forward to that webinar, and do encourage you all to be there. Let me apologise to a magnificent cast of people that couldn't get to ask their question because we ran out of time. Kaho Mok, Connor McKenzie, Ron Barnett, Charito Pizzero, Mada Kozlowska, and Turka Kurt. No doubt we could have composed a very interesting panel from that group of people on this topic. But once again, thanks, James. Thanks to our redoubtable Mary Bowen Perkins, who does such a great job with our communications. And thanks to everyone who took part and stayed to the end and even past the end today. Look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. Bye for now.